In the year 1500, somewhere deep in the mountainous heart of the Japanese archipelago, a fortress of stone and timber rises above a wooded ridge. From a distance, everything looks almost still. Banners hang motionless in the morning air, and thin smoke drifts up from a few chimneys behind the wooden walls. Yet inside, hidden behind layered earthworks and dry-stacked stone, several hundred people are already awake and already working, preparing for an attack that might come this very season, or maybe not for another 5 years. This documentary, rebuilt with the help of artificial intelligence, takes us inside one of these mountain strongholds at the peak of the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states, when Japan had broken apart into dozens of rival territories, and the only things that truly mattered were honor, steel, and silence. The world surrounding this castle in the year 1500 is one of mere constant, low-level warfare. The Ashikaga shogunate, founded in the early 1300s, had essentially lost its power as a national authority a generation before this. The Onin War, which tore apart 2/3 of the capital city of Kyoto between 1467 and 1477, is remembered as the conflict that triggered the Sengoku period. After that war, the shoguns kept their ceremonial status, but held almost no real power beyond the capital region. Out in the provinces, a new kind of regional warlord had risen up called the Sengoku daimyo, ruling their lands without any imperial appointment, answering to nothing but the strength of their own armies. Historians believe that during this time, Japan was split into dozens of these rival states, caught in constantly shifting alliances, betrayals, and seasonal cycles of raiding and counter-raiding. The castle on the ridge stands as a visible symbol of this broken order. Fortresses like this one, known as yamashiro or mountain castles, were the main type of stronghold throughout the Sengoku era. By the late 1400s, the more significant of these complexes had grown into elaborate, many-layered fortresses that made full use of the mountain's natural shape to strengthen their defenses. Massive walls built from dry-stacked stone, a method called ishigaki, form terraces along the slopes. The stones aren't held together with mortar, they're chosen carefully for their shape and weight, and the resulting walls can absorb both earthquakes and the force of an attack. Above these stone foundations stand wooden halls, watchtowers called yagura, and sprawling residential buildings. The layout of a fortress like this is deliberately confusing. The most central area, where the lord and his closest retainers live, is called the honmaru. Around it sit secondary enclosures known as the ninomaru and the sannomaru, each one separated by gates, walls, and narrow passageways designed to force any attacker to expose themselves at every turn. Around the year 1500, firearms haven't yet reached Japan. They won't arrive until 1543, brought by Portuguese traders to the island of Tanegashima. So the defenders of these castles still depend on the longbow, the spear, and the curved sword. Water is one of the constant concerns of life in a mountain castle. Wells dug at such heights can be unreliable, so water carriers are some of the most numerous and least noticed people living in the castle, hauling buckets up the slopes from springs or from cisterns carved into the rock. Stores of grain, salt, and dried fish are checked with just as much care as the weapon racks in the armory. The architecture of the living quarters increasingly follows a style called shoin-zukuri, which had developed during the Muromachi period as the standard form for high-ranking samurai residences. By the end of the 1400s, tatami mats, made of compressed rice straw covered in woven rush, are widely used as flooring in the rooms of the nobility and the warrior class. Rooms are divided by fusuma,
solid sliding panels covered in thick paper, and by shoji, translucent screens made of white mulberry paper stretched over wooden frames, which let in a soft, diffused light even when closed. There's no furniture in the way we think of it today. People sit directly on the matted floor. Meals are served on low, individual trays, and bedding is folded away into wooden cupboards during the day. Inside a residence like this, a daimyo of this period would usually hold a morning audience in the main hall of the inner enclosure. That audience itself, more than any single person, was the real institution, the moment when the political life of the domain became visible. At these gatherings, the karo, senior retainers whose families had served the ruling line for generations, brought reports from village headmen, news from neighboring domains, complaints about flooded rice fields, and rumors of betrayal among allies.
The karo acted almost like a council of ministers, sharing responsibility for policy, finances, public works, and religious matters. It was customary for men holding this rank to come from households long tied to the ruling family through generations of hereditary service. Scribes attached to the lord's household kept records of rice income, of tax obligations owed by the villages, and of weapons handed out to retainers. The survival of the domain depended just as much on accurate bookkeeping as it did on sharp swords. Below the karo, mid-ranking samurai handled specific duties, overseeing granaries, inspecting armor, managing the stables, and supervising the messengers who carried sealed letters between domains. Any castle of real importance functioned at once as a fortress, a treasury, a courthouse, and a chancery. In the courtyards and along the outer walls, military training began before dawn. Samurai retainers rose early, washed their face and hands in cold water, then made their way to the training grounds. Archery, known as kyujutsu, was practiced with the yumi, the long, asymmetrical Japanese bow, often aimed at straw targets. Mounted archery was treated as a higher art, one that took years to master. Swordsmanship, kenjutsu, was practiced using wooden training swords called bokken. And the spear, or yari, was actually more central to real battlefield combat in this period than the sword was. Young men of the warrior class learned more than just how to fight. They also studied calligraphy, the Chinese classics, Zen Buddhist meditation, and basic administration. The ideal that slowly took shape during this era and was later formalized into what became known as Bushido held that a warrior should be equally skilled in both martial and cultural arts. Around the year 1500, this ideal hadn't yet been written down as a single formal code, but its core elements, loyalty to one's lord, contempt for personal fear, and a willingness to die without hesitation, were already deeply rooted in the samurai mindset. Two ideas in particular shaped the moral atmosphere inside the castle. Giri, the sense of obligation owed to one's lord, one's family, and one's own honor, and On, the debt of gratitude owed to those, especially the lord, who had granted land, rank, or protection. Failing in Giri, or leaving an On unpaid, was seen as a stain that couldn't simply be shrugged off.
In extreme cases, when a failure or dishonor was considered beyond repair, the response demanded by the warrior code was seppuku, ritual self-ending, through which a samurai sought to restore his name. The quiet intensity of life in the castle, the careful etiquette of every audience and every meal, all of it rested on the understanding that a samurai's life was never fully his own, and that duty could call on it at any moment. The diet that sustained this disciplined world is often misunderstood. Around the year 1500, white rice was a prestige food, not something most people in the castle ate every day.
Most of the calories eaten by lower-ranking samurai, foot soldiers, and household servants came from coarser grains, barley, millet, and sometimes wheat. A common dish was mugimeshi, barley and rice cooked together, which stretched out the more expensive grain while adding fiber and minerals. Higher-ranking samurai had more regular access to white rice, but even in the elite kitchens, it was usually served alongside a small bowl of miso soup, pickled vegetables, and a modest portion of fish or seasonal greens. Miso, the fermented soybean paste that had spread across Japan over the preceding centuries, was by this point a basic seasoning used at every level of society. Early forms of soy sauce were also starting to circulate, helped along by growing salt production along the coasts. Pickled vegetables, generally known as tsukemono, were prepared by salting, by burying in rice bran, or by curing in miso. Daikon radish, pickled plums, cucumbers, and seasonal mountain greens were kept in large wooden tubs through the long winters when fresh produce was hard to come by. Dried fish brought in from the coast was carried inland and stored for months at a time. The question of meat was complicated by religion. Buddhist teachings against taking animal life had shaped Japanese cooking ever since Zen and other Buddhist schools arrived in earlier centuries. Shojin ryori, the strictly vegetarian cuisine developed in Zen temples, excluded not just meat and fish, but also strong-smelling ingredients like garlic and onion, and its influence had spread from the temples into the eating habits of the samurai and aristocratic classes. In many regions around the year 1500, eating four-legged animals in everyday meals was generally avoided, though wild game was still eaten in mountain villages and during military campaigns. The image of samurai feasting on cuts of red meat owes far more to later imagination than to the reality of this period. A castle kitchen of this size operated like a small industry. Cooks tended low charcoal hearths built into the earthen floor and managed iron pots hung from chains above them. Meals were carried out on lacquered trays, and each rank was served according to strict rules that determined how many dishes a person received and how refined the rice would be. In the lord's quarters, a single tray might hold 5 or 7 dishes. In the servants' quarters, a meal might be just a bowl of barley and millet, a slice of pickled radish, and a portion of soup. This hierarchy showed itself at every single meal. Outside the kitchens, the castle's support staff gave it the feel of a small town. Smiths repaired armor and sharpened swords. Bowyers crafted the long laminated bows that were a samurai's pride. Carpenters kept the wooden galleries, staircases, and gates in working order. Saddlers and stable hands looked after the horses, some of the most valuable possessions in the entire domain. From the surrounding villages, peasants arrived carrying sacks of rice and bundles of straw, paying their dues in goods rather than coin. The garrison itself was made up of 2 broad groups. At its core stood the samurai retainers, hereditary warriors bound to the lord through oaths of service, often only a few dozen of the highest rank, along with a few hundred mid- and lower-ranking warriors in a major castle. Around them gathered the Ashikaga, light foot soldiers drawn from the peasantry, who fought mainly with the long spear and the bow. Around the year 1500, the Ashikaga of a typical garrison were basically a body of spearmen and archers, lightly armored in leather and iron lamellar plates, wearing conical hats that also served as helmets. The women of the samurai class made up another part of castle life that often gets overlooked. Inside the inner halls, they ran the kitchens, the storehouses, and the household accounts, and in doing so, they often controlled real resources of their own. They organized the household's textile work, the weaving, the dyeing of cloth, the making of garments. They were also expected to be literate and to know the classical poetry that marked a person of their class as cultivated. And just as important, they had to be able to defend the castle whenever their husbands were away on campaign. Women of the warrior class trained from childhood with the naginata, a polearm with a long curved blade on a wooden shaft, a weapon well suited for keeping mounted or armored enemies at a distance. Tradition holds that these onabugeisha, the women warriors of the samurai class, were expected to defend the inner enclosure whenever the male retainers were gone, and in some documented cases from the Sengoku era, such women actually led troops and organized armed resistance during sieges. Life inside the castle followed a daily rhythm shaped by rank and by the season. In autumn, rice from the villages came up the mountain roads, and inspectors counted and stored every delivery. Winter was given over to repairs and training indoors. In spring, the peasants had to stay in the fields for planting, so military campaigns were usually put on hold. But the moment the harvest was in, the season of war started up again. At any moment, a castle in this period might get a runner bringing word that a neighboring lord's army was moving into the valley, that an alliance had broken apart, or that some rebellious branch of the family was raising its banners. Scholars point out that few Sengoku daimyo of that generation died peacefully in their own beds. The danger from inside the walls was just as constant as the danger from outside. Betrayal by a trusted retainer, a vassal house switching sides, a secret marriage deal that could flip alliances overnight. These were the recurring nightmares of the age. The word gekokujo, meaning the low overthrowing the high, summed up an era where even long-established families could be pushed aside in a single generation by their own officers. Etiquette was the visible way loyalty got shown and tested. A modest shrine to a local kami or a Buddhist guardian deity was kept inside or just outside the inner enclosure. Monks and priests came to perform rites for the ancestors, to chant for the souls of fallen retainers, and to bless the harvest and the weapons. Zen meditation especially had become tied to the samurai class, valued as a practice that steadied the mind against fear. Shinto rituals existed side by side with Buddhist ceremonies, and most people in the castle saw no conflict in honoring both. As evening came on, the pace of the castle slowed but never really stopped. Sentries took their posts on the yagura towers and along the wooden walkways. Oil lamps were lit in the corridors. In the inner hall, the karo might deliver one last report, and the orders for the night watch would be confirmed. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and the banners that had hung still at dawn now stirred in the dusk. Most of the yamashiro standing in the year 1500 would not make it through the wars still to come. Many were destroyed by siege, by fire, or simply abandoned once their lord's line died out. Decades later, the unifying campaigns of Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu would bring a new political order to the islands. The tight, intimate corridors of the yamashiro would give way to wider walls built to withstand cannon fire, and to massive stone foundations holding up towering wooden keeps. But in the year 1500, none of that was visible yet. The castle on the ridge simply stood there. Its people lived by a code of honor that allowed no easy retreat. They ate barley and millet, miso soup, and pickled radish. They trained at dawn with bow and spear. To understand a world like this is to remember that the samurai castle of the Sengoku Jidai was not some romantic stage set, but a working machine of administration and defense, ordered by a hierarchy as strict as its architecture, and driven by a moral code where honor, steel, and silence weren't abstract ideas. They were the everyday texture of life.